Good evening and welcome to another Indie Dev interview here on Game Wisdom for our Perceptive podcast series, where we examine the art and science of games. I am, of course, Josh Blaser, and my guest tonight is an indie dev who's currently working on their first game, a kind of 2D shoot 'em up called Odd Infinitum, which hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly. He is self-taught, and he is going to talk a little bit about what he's been working on, and I'm sure we'll get into a variety of game design questions and topics as well. So please welcome to our discussion, Lee Easson. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
It is great to have you on, and thank you again for reaching out and expressing interest. As I always tell people on all the social medias and so on, if you are working on a game, just want to talk game dev with me, and would like to come for one of these chats, please reach out. All my DMs, inboxes, and all that are all open. So thank you again for getting in touch.
Yeah, definitely. I guess a little bit about myself. So, as Josh mentioned, I am an entirely self-taught game designer / game developer. I started off my game development journey. When I got into college, I started off in computer science because I knew around middle school that I wanted to make games somehow, some way. And so I taught myself Python programming. I majored in computer science. And starting sophomore year of college, I started playing around with engines like GameMaker and Unity, trying to figure out what I can make. And around that time, I developed the very first version of my current game project, Odd Infinitum. It started off as just an exercise to make a game, just any game, get something out there. Then at some points, I kind of fell in love with the project, and I thought, I see the value in this idea. I'd like to make it commercial. And I've been working on it ever since. And
So
it's still going, frankly.
so how long have you been actually working on it for?
So I started July 2016, so about 7 years.
Hmm. Yeah, and that can always be challenging, especially being self-taught as to kind of like, how do you kind of get off the ground? So I guess that's actually a really good question to start things off with for you, Lee. As someone who's both self-taught and working on your first game, what was it kind of like trying to like piece it all together on your own?
I didn't take any classes on game developments, so YouTube was my teacher. In fact, arguably my game development sensei, shout out to this person, is Tim Ruswick of Game Dev Underground. Like, his videos were there, and they were short, concise, informative. And without him, I'd be very directionless.
And I have spoken to Tim several times. He is definitely knowledgeable on it. And my videos are longer and more meatier when it comes to the stuff that I tend to talk about, which is always a challenge when it comes to like learning game design. Is that there is a very, very wide amount of topics when it comes to game dev, and I think it's almost impossible for one person to just kind of cover every single thing that's out there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the way I see it, the actual development of a game has gotten easier and easier because engines like Unity and Unreal Engine are now free, open to the public,
Mhm.
and there's countless books and YouTube tutorials on how to make a game, which means that there's so many developers, so many games getting released. So now the challenge is not just to make a game, the challenge is to make a marketable game.
And that is something that I have spoken about at great length in all my videos, all the interviews, roundtables that we've done here, and it is a very big difference. As I'm sure you and any other indie devs watching this recorded right now can certainly demonstrate or allude to.
Yeah, definitely. With Odd Infinitum, uh, for the longest time, I kind of struggled with the elevator pitch of sorts. Like, how do I concisely describe it? For a long time, I kind of went with a Souls-like shoot 'em up, But then I realized that the term Souls-like conjures different connotations. Like when you think Souls-like, you think of a third-person hack and slash, usually medieval dark fantasy, dungeon crawler, high difficulty. And so you look at the 2D shoot 'em up that's Odd Infinitum, and you're like, this looks more like Gradius or R-Type. Like, how is this Souls-like? So I kind of pivoted to, instead of calling it Souls-like, but Souls-inspired. And the reason why is because the character progression, where you start off kind of equipment poor, but as you defeat more and more bosses, you level up in a way. There are no stats or leveling up per se, but you do get better equipment, you get experience, and in doing so, it's a very intriguing like power leveling that's very similar to how it's done in a standard Souls-like game.
And I think the funny thing is that as you were talking about that, I'm currently in the middle of writing my next design book all about Souls-like. So it's going to be up to me to define that and make sure everyone gets it as well.
Yeah, the whole meaning of words thing. Like, I think there's a similar debate on the term roguelike.
I was like literally just about to say that too.
Yeah, it's just like it's a game like Rogue, the 1980 like ASCII dungeon crawler. Like the trademark features of Rogue were the randomly generated dungeons and the permadeath, and also like I think also turn-based combat was a staple of Rogue. But then with modern Rogue likes and Rogue lights, like a lot of them don't have turn-based combat. Like a lot of it's real-time 2D combat. So it's like, okay, is it Rogue like, or is it just like Rogue light? Because it only takes two of the pillars of what makes Rogue Rogue. So I guess it's in a similar case with Dark Souls and Souls-likes. It's like, okay, does it have to be like challenging? Like, does it have to involve like dying a bunch of times? Does it have to take place in a medieval setting? Frankly, no. Does it have to have character customization? Does it have to have I'm trying to think what else. Does it have to have like a certain like level progression? So I guess we're kind of in that debate now.
Yep, and same thing goes for stuff like what is a Metroidvania, what is an RPG is another fun one. That was a nightmare of a book to write in terms of trying to explain everything about what RPG design is.
Oh man.
It is
it
is certainly lengthy there. To go back to our point about kind of like how much game design has changed and evolved. As you were saying a minute ago, when we look at kind of like the state of the market, I just at the time of as we're talking, I just posted our a podcast I did with my other friend Josh. We were talking about how indie game coverage has really changed as well, and the market has really shifted over the past 13 years, as you said. And again, like for people watching us who may be on the younger side, maybe they just started game dev 4 or 5 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. As long as you could get a game out there, most likely you could easily get eyes on it because no one else was really making games. Again, like Steam was like the badge of honor. You get on Steam in 2010, you're good. Like that is your game dev success story right there.
Yeah.
Now we fast forward today, and as you said, like it's no longer about just saying, well, if I can make a game, then that's good enough. Now it's I need to make a game that can appeal to a market, that can get eyes on a YouTuber or an influencer. And that is a very different thing. And as we'll talk about in the next few minutes about kind of building a game and adding more systems to it, it means really you have to get your idea solidified as quickly as possible. And if you don't do that, it can lead to like this game just like not having an identity. And as you were saying with the, trying to explain as a Souls-like, if you can't explain to someone in like 5 seconds why they should play your game, they're not sticking around. And it's a very, It's both really good in that anyone can make a game, but it's also very scary that people will stop playing game. People won't even look at your store page for literally any reason. And something that, as someone who covers so many indie games, I've had to like see that firsthand. That hey, I really like this game, and it only has like 2 reviews on Steam because no one else is really playing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we call those hidden gems.
Mm-hmm. For sure, and it is and I guess for you, like as you've been learning game dev, you mentioned, of course, you use the videos of Tim Ruswick and stuff like that. Any other useful sources, like for like any students or first timers, that kind of helped you out the most?
Game Maker's Toolkit is another good one. Shout out to Mark Brown. Um, both Game Dev Underground and Game Maker's Toolkits, they're great for kind of a very high-level explanation of certain design concepts like skill trees or leveling up or design by subtraction. I also like more video essay focused channels like Super Bunny Hop and Errant Signal.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those channels are more kind of into the like design philosophy side instead of just like practical design tips. Like Errant Signal has videos on like what constitutes a game,
Mm-hmm.
like and he contrasts core versus casual. Also talks about um, like violence in video games, why violence has just become like a natural part of video game structure, and
Mm-hmm.
the simple reason is because it allows for mechanics that are just easier to like understand, to grok.
Yeah.
And also video games are a very spatial medium, and so like spatially based um, real-time combat just works very well with a video game space.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, like there is that difference between kind of like the structure or the procedural aspect of making a game. How do I, program RPG leveling? How do I make jumping work in a game
Mm-hmm.
versus the actual philosophy? What constitutes a good platformer? What makes an
Yeah.
RPG system work? And that's the kind of thing that I'm always very interested in. It's some stuff that I have spoken a lot about. And it's one of those aspects where, and I guess this could be a good question for you as well, as someone who's still like kind of on your solo dev career. Like, if we were talking about learning game design 20, 30 years ago, everyone would be kind of focusing more on the procedural side. It will be, again, about very hard rules. This is how you
Mm-hmm.
program a first person shooter, this is how you program a platformer. But as someone who's learning game design today, do you feel that the philosophy side, the understanding of why a jump works like this, or how to make something feel good, do you feel like that has gotten either equal or more credence in terms of learning game dev, like in today's market?
Mm. So if I understand your question correctly,
Mm-hmm.
the actual design, like the actual thinking
Mm-hmm.
behind design concepts, not just the hard programming, has
Yes.
that gone up or down
Mm-hmm.
in importance? Um, I'd say it's gone up by a bit because, I mean, as I alluded to before, like to learn how to program a platformer, to learn how to code in movements and jumping and climbing, that's a few that's watching a few YouTube tutorials.
Mm-hmm.
But to understand the like to understand more subtle nuances, such as what should the movement speed be, what should the acceleration of the jump look like, um, and for quality of life mechanics like coyote time, how many frames of coyote time should be allowed. So questions like those, like careful consideration of those kinds of questions, can make for good platformers versus bad platformers, but also like different kinds of platformers. Like if you analyze the acceleration of the jump in, say, Super Mario Brothers versus Celeste versus Limbo. All of them are different, and all of them are good platformers. But just because of the fine tuning of their movements and jumping and the speed and acceleration of both of those, all of them have different feels. Well, additionally, all of them have different feels because of their atmosphere too.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something that I started writing and talking about game design. This was like 2009, 2010. And I think it has really changed. I think part of it has been, as we've been saying, so many more people are getting in the game industry. And that means
Mm-hmm.
so many different kinds of feels when it comes to a game. As you just alluded to, playing Super Mario Odyssey versus Celeste, it's almost like two different languages in terms of how
Right.
those games are going to be played. And one of the things that I think I've learned and something that I've witnessed for a lot of I should say, a lot of first time indie developers is that you can get the kind of structure down. You can say, I want to make a first person shooter like Doom. I want to make a real time strategy game like Warcraft. But if you don't understand kind of the decision making and the philosophy behind those decisions, you either end up with a game that is either less than the sum of its parts, or you're just literally remaking Doom again, or you're
Right.
remaking Mario again.
Yeah, and related to like the contrast between different kinds of first-person shooters, like with the basic first-person shooter structure, you can branch off into all sorts of different feels. You
Mm-hmm.
could have a first-person shooter that's a horror game or an action game, and within action game, it's like, is it like tense? Is it like tense action, or is it more visceral action? By which I mean, is it more like Call of Duty, where it's like push forward and hide behind cover, or is it more like Doom, where it's about the power fantasy, where the biggest threat in the room is you, not
Mm-hmm.
the enemies like across the range?
Mm-hmm. And to get to that point where you can start really differentiating your game from someone else, it takes understanding again how that genre works, what doesn't
Mm-hmm.
work, what does work. And that in and of itself, I feel like that's something that more and more you can watch videos, you can watch, a YouTuber or a streamer pick any game you want, unless
Mm-hmm.
your hands are behind that keyboard or using that gamepad, you're not necessarily going to get the feel of it. You're not going to understand
Right.
why does shooting this fireball at a dragon in whatever game, why does it feel good in this one? But then if I'm using
Mm.
this, Gatling gun rocket launcher in this game, it just feels plain and it's boring. Like,
Yeah.
why?
Yeah. I mean that can come down to like the fine tuning of what's called game juice. Like, sure, the Gatling gun rocket launcher may do a lot of damage, but if it lacks things like the right amount of recoil or like certain amount of screen shaker, particle effects, like it can feel just like boring, like any other weapon. Like
Mm-hmm.
you want, if you want a great, big, powerful, awesome weapon, I mean, it has to feel great, big, powerful, and awesome. Even though the damage numbers are higher, like it should feel like it's a powerful weapon.
Yeah. And that's like the kind of thing, as we've been saying, that if you just watch a video on how to program a first person shooter in Unity or Unreal, that's the kind of stuff you're probably not going to hear about in that video because we're getting away from kind of the hard numbers. Again, you can you can put in your code, fireball does 100 million damage.
Hmm.
But if it comes off as just like that when someone uses
Yeah,
it, okay, it's like, yes, there's numbers, but okay, wow. And then the person's just not really
yeah,
going to be interested in it.
yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, I was at an indie game convention a 4 weeks back, I think, and it was a nice showcase of small indie games. And I played one indie game that was there, and it was the way I describe the art style is it's like it looked like Baba Is You, with but like 16 bits.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the art style looked like. And like the game was fine. There was stuff to do. There was like a small world to explore. Like the biggest piece of advice that I gave to the developer was like add more feel, add more juice. Like it should be very obvious when I'm dealing damage and also when I'm taking damage. Like there should be no ambiguity of did I get hit? Did I not get hit? It's like it, and related to the whole knowing when you take damage. Like in my own game, Odd Infinitum, it's quite obvious when you take damage because when you take damage, what happens is there's a small freeze frame, there's a sound effect, a red screen flashes briefly, there's the blinking iframes afterwards, and also there is a neat glitch shader effect that lingers for a bit. And the glitch shader like makes for such a juicy effect that I've had people playtest my game and they actually weirdly enjoy getting hit just because the glitch effect is just so juicy to watch.
I was actually watching a design video, Sakurai from Smash Brothers. He has his own game dev series now. He was talking about like having those elements where if you have a particularly like important moment, slow things down, use effects, and make it like really pop to the player. And as you're saying, as we've been talking about, like this is the kind of stuff that sticks in someone's mind. Like even that simple act of stopping the game for like that half or even a quarter second when you get a perfect parry or you get hit, it kind of locks that memory in the player's mind that wow, something just happened. And like it's these kinds of moments where it kind of keeps someone invested in the game. Again, it's that difference between shooting an enemy with a weapon and they just go, and that's it, versus you shoot an enemy and, we get the full ragdoll, or the guy's by completely lurches back, or even, again, like the classic Doom shotgun, that, 1 second sound clip of that shotgun being fired is so synonymous with FPS design and gunplay.
Yeah, related to what you said where, like, sticks in players' minds, it's the kind of thing where if the player does notice it, they won't say anything about it beyond, wow, this feels good. But if it's not there, then they notice it. Like, it's kind of like a camera system. Like, a camera system is only talked about if it's bad. Because the whole point of a camera system is to focus on something other than itself. So, if the focus is on the bad camera, then something has gone awry.
Yeah. And it's the same thing with UI design. People will not complain about people will never praise a game for good UI, but they will yell at you on forums and message boards if your UI is bad.
Yeah, like the YouTube channel Design Doc has the good design, bad design, where he shows examples of good UX/UI and contrasts with a bad example. That series is quite entertaining. This reminds me. A few years ago, when I was working on my master's degree, I was a TA for a game design class, and it was Unreal Engine focused. And basically, the final project was about halfway through the semester, form groups, come up with a design concept, and you have the rest of the semester to make it. It's basically a game jam that lasts for like a month and a half. And so I was reviewing like high-level one-page design documents, and there was one student group that had the concept for a game. I think they called it like RNG Geddon, as in Armageddon. And basically, it was intended to be like a very wacky, like RNG heavy, like kind of first-person shooter dungeon crawler. And in the like brief audience statement, they listed fans of dungeon crawlers, obviously, fans of first-person shooters, obviously, but they also said fans of RNG. And I'm like, what does that mean? It's just like that's like saying fans of cameras or fans of save systems. It's like it's an integral feature of a game, but you can't really say there's a fan. Like, they're fans of any of those systems. Like, again, you'll notice if the RNG is incredibly bad, if it's incredibly unfair, but if the RNG works perfectly well, no one's going to say anything.
Mm-hmm. And that also means, as a designer, it's very hard when you're doing playtesting.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And again, like, I just cause a lot of people just like get a stress migraine as I uttered the word playtesting here.
Oh yeah.
And it kind of goes back to that original point we were discussing about making a commercial game today. That you can sit and make a game for how many days, weeks, months, years you want. That doesn't mean that you're going to put that in front of someone. They're going to immediately say, "This is an amazing game. I love it. I'm never going to stop playing it."
Right, right.
And conversely, you put that in front of someone, they'll be like, "This is the worst damn game I've ever played. You know, how the hell did you make this?" And, you know, just quit game dev.
Yeah.
And neither one of those really helps you when it comes to the question of, do I have a good game here?
Right, right. Like, it's important to, like, I think people get attached to the fantasy of the brave solo game developer that spends a couple years locked away in their bedroom, like, not seeing sunlight during that time. They just slave away at a game, they release it, and boom, it's highly praised, and you become a millionaire. That's kind of what happened to Eric Barone, the developer of Stardew Valley. But Eric Barone is the massive, massive exception.
Yep.
Like, what's more than likely to happen is you spend 2 years developing the game, you say nothing about it, you release it, and no one finds it.
Yep. And again, as someone who has been covering indie games for now over 13 years, I've seen that happen quite a bit. I've spoken to developers that has happened to them. And again, it's why so much of what goes into good game dev, we're not even talking about game design, just good game dev, is the marketing, is the social media presence. It's making sure that when you say, you know, my name is blah, 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 and I'm working on this, people go, "Oh yeah, I heard of that game," or, you know, "My friend mentioned it and they saw it on some YouTuber channel." Because the nightmare scenario, again, I've noticed a trend in a lot of my design topics these days. I think I'm just causing PTSD for indie devs. And if I mention this stuff, the nightmare scenario is you release that game, no one knows who you are. No one has heard of this game, no one has seen it, and the game just kind of goes like that on day one. And it is, again, something that I think it keeps a lot of indie developers up at night thinking about.
Oh yeah. Like, I think it comes down to not just a concept of marketability, but remarkability. Like, one way to, and this kind of helps with figuring out like an elevator pitch or a concise way to describe your game. Can you describe your game as that game with blank? Because the example I give is when Cuphead was first announced in 2015, I think. Like, what do people know it as? That game that looks like an old cartoon. Its art style is what sold it, and that got people interested initially, and it was made even more fascinating by the fact that they actually used traditional animation techniques. So yes, every frame that you're seeing on screen was hand drawn. It was not hand colored. That would have added like 2 extra years of development. But it's just mind blowing to think that every frame of Cuphead's movement, every frame of every boss's movement, some artist or a team of artists had to sit down and draw individual frames. It's mind-boggling.
Yep. And that was, as you said, that was the selling point. People saw that, and going back to what you were saying about like having like that kind of juice in your game, that got people talking about Cuphead. And that word eventually reached Microsoft, who then offered them a publishing deal. And one of the bigger aspects, and this is something that I want to ask you about as a solo developer. One of the most challenging aspects that I see, like indie developers, whether they are first timers, enthusiast students, or even some more established people, is being able to like kind of sit back and try to figure out why did this game do well. Because again, people can just sit around and theory craft about, oh, Darkest Dungeon did well because they had Wayne June giving moody readings, and that was how the game sold. Or
yeah.
FTL did well because it was a brutally difficult spaceship game. But one of the things that I've been seeing is that a very essential skill for people starting out is being able to kind of look not just at a game, but look at everything around that game to try and figure out why did it succeed. And I wanted to ask you, as a sole developer, like, when you're like looking at other games, I'm sure since you're working on kind of a shoot 'em up style game, you've probably been watching and paying attention to other shoot 'em ups out there.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, or like, what are your thoughts on like studying another game? Like, what are you looking at? What aren't you paying attention to? That kind of thing.
Usually, when I play games, I'm almost always in designer mode, inspiration mode. Like, even something that's not a shoot 'em up. Like, I played a lot of Into the Breach, and I've actually gotten inspiration from Into the Breach, particularly in the approach to like leveling up that's not actually leveling up, as in you find better equipment to give yourself the edge against an ever increasing threat. Like, I looked at that sort of progression and feel, and I was like, okay, how do I integrate that into Odd Infinitum? Like, and also what I like about Into the Breach is that it has a very strong fantasy. Like, you actually feel like the Vec are not just like dumb enemies. They are a threat. They are an invasion. Like, they're here, they're invading Earth, and the only thing that's stopping the Vec from absolutely destroying leveling cities is your own squad of mechs. And what's interesting about Into the Breach is that, like, it does like the whole roguelike iterative gameplay in a very believable way. Like, of course there's permadeath, but it's contextualized as the mech squad is time travelers. And so a timeline that ends in failure means that, okay, this timeline is lost. We just warp to another timeline and hope to save that one. That was kind of a tangent. Let's see what else. I mean, basically what I'm saying is, yeah, I'm looking for inspiration not just in like other shoot 'em up games, like particularly kind of modern takes on like 2D shoot 'em ups. Like, my favorite one is it's called Devil Engine. I've taken a lot of inspiration from that game, particularly in the certain attacks of bosses. Like, I look at certain attacks and I think, okay, like, there's this attack, it's positioned this way. What is that trying to tell me? Like, it's trying to, like, where is it trying to make me position my ship? Like, how is it trying to make me move? That's the question I ask myself when I look at attack patterns in other shoot 'em up games. So basically the answer is I look for inspiration in pretty much everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to do that because you never know, again, like how the market is really evolving for that genre. One of a story that I remember from an indie developer I was talking to, this was like 7-8 years ago, was they started working on this kind of like turn-based, like a space combat style game. And in the middle of them spending so long working on it, everyone else caught up to them and kind of overtook them in terms of releasing space-based style games, turn-based and space games. And their game just ended up kind of falling into like the sea of all those other games. It didn't really do anything that could stand out. More importantly, it didn't do anything that could stand out in a marketable way. And as we've been saying, like that is oftentimes like what can all separate an indie dev's game from succeeding versus one that kind of just again it falls into that hidden gem we never really hear about category because
Hmm.
the consumer is not going to care about a 40-minute sob story about how long you work on your game. They may care for 3 seconds. Look at the
Right.
thumbnail and then that's it.
Yeah, very true. Um, the thing about trends, I think as Yossi Croshaw put it, it's practically a field of quantum mechanics, meaning that once you have caught on to a trend, you're too late. Like by the time you commit to making a game that's following a trend, and by the time you release it, that trend is likely past. Or what's often the case is with a trend is there's a bunch of developers that jump onto that trend, but then there's one developer that does it so exceedingly well that it basically cannibalizes its other competition. Like take the battle royale shooter for example. Technically, I mean, technically, PlayerUnknown PUBG started the trend, and which was basically the inspiration came from what if the battle royale structure, as in the film, but we make it into like, but we integrate that into your standard team deathmatch gameplay mode, and it turned out to be a wild success. So much so that it was getting Game of the Year nominations, even though it was still in early access. And so people caught other developers caught on to the trend of okay, battle royale team deathmatch. That sounds like a good idea. That sounds like consumers are jumping onto this, that they enjoy it. And so there were several other developers jumping onto that trend. And then Epic Games had the wild idea to let's take our team-based shooter Fortnite and add in a battle royale mode. And boom, that exploded in popularity. It's making Epic Games tons of money every year.
Mm-hmm.
And now, is anyone trying to make a battle royale shooter? No, because Fortnite has done it so well, and it's still ruling the roost. And also because Fortnite is established, fans of that genre, when they see a new, if they were to see a competing like battle royale shooter game, they'd be like, why would I want to play this when Fortnite is still here?
And the funny thing is that you're saying that whole thing happened once before in 2004 with World of Warcraft, and how the MMO genre kind of blew up and then burned down over the span of
Oh
maybe
yeah,
like 5 to 6 years of everyone thinking, oh, I'll just make World of Warcraft, but with Harry Potter or with Star Wars. And not one of those games ever came close. And again, like the funniest thing, of course, that right now the number one MMO is Final Fantasy. I always forget. I think it's 13. I always forget like which number is the MMO Final Fantasy.
there, there, there's some formula to it. Like one of my friends plays Final Fantasy. I think it's like every third Final Fantasy game is an MMO. I think. Why every third? I don't know.
Me neither. And you were just saying Battle Royale. Right now, as someone who cover games, I am in the Vampire Survivor like
Yeah.
explosion. I have played. Oh my god! I think I've played like 40 to 50 different Vampire Survivor likes in the last year. And
Hmm.
the problem, again, as we were talking about with trends and so on, is that why should someone play your version of Vampire Survivor when Vampire Survivor is right here, all
Right.
nice and glittery and with all the updates, and they're still expanding on it? And a lot of developers sadly don't have an answer for that. And even if you legitimately do something better, even if you do manage to out Vampire Survivors, why should someone give your game the time of day? And what you just said a minute ago about when fans become like defensive of, the number one or the poster boy of that genre, they're going to take one look at your game and go, oh, this is just a rip off of this. I'm never going to play it.
Right. I've noticed that I think a good piece of wisdom or advice, if you're trying to enter into a saturated genre, like right now I'm pursuing an MBA, so I've picked up a few like business terminology. There are three ways to there are three types of competitive advantages: cost, product, and niche. Cost is pretty simple. You price your products lower than your competition, which is not simple to do. Per the revenue formula, or per the profit formula, revenue minus costs. If your costs are if your costs are low, or I mean, if your revenue is low but your costs are still high, keep that up, you eventually go out of business.
Yep.
Like, you can't just open a grocery store and price your products lower than Walmart's unless you have like scalability behind it. So if you can't do cost, perhaps you can do product. What product is basically like, your product may not be cheaper than the alternatives, but it does something unique. Like, for example, Tom's, the shoes. Like, they're not great shoes, they're not expensive shoes, but they do have a mission behind it where it's like, if you buy a pair of Tom's shoes, one pair is donated to children in third world countries or something like that. And the third type is niche, where basically you do one thing so incredibly well that the people who are into that particular niche come to you. And if you're just starting out in a particular field, particularly one that's competitive or saturated, going with a niche approach is actually pretty viable, because like, a niche audience is usually very small, so you don't have to do any sort of like mass outreach. But the challenge there is you really have to listen to what the niche audience wants. They're very particular, they're very picky, but if you please them well, they will buy your stuff. Pretty much guaranteed.
Yep.
That's kind of the approach. That's kind of the approach of From Software. Like, when, like, late 2000s, games were pushing towards more towards like cinematic gameplay, accessibility. So the niche audience of gamers that craved retro-inspired difficulty were starved for attention. And so From Software recognized that underserved niche and were like, here's a game that's retro-inspired, it's do or die difficulty, and completing is a badge of honor. And those gamers are like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted.
And then the challenge then becomes, do you still follow that niche, or do you try to expand? And for a lot of developers, they run into that very painful moment where they realize, I want to appeal to all these people, but guess what? All these people do not have the same sensibilities and preferences as my little niche over here. And do you keep with the niche, or do you try to expand? It's an ever popular phrase, you try to please everyone, or do you end up pleasing no one with your game?
Right. Yeah, that can be difficult when you're known for something. You're known for a particular genre. When you do try to expand, you run the risk of, it's kind of a double-edged sword. If you keep doing the same thing, you run the risk of your audience going, okay, it's just more of the same.
Yep.
But if you too dramatically change up your style, your audience will complain, oh, it's too different. It's not like the older stuff. Like, you see that with a lot of like bands when they try to change up their sound. Like, a lot of the complaints are, this is too different. This doesn't sound like their old material. But at the same time, if a band just like releases the same album again and again and again and again, people are like, this is boring. Try something new.
And the funny thing is, like, we've been talking about this from the independent space. The same could also be said with a lot of AAA studios who have tried to do very massive pivots with their franchises and their brands. BioWare took a massive hit when they tried to make a third-person shooter with Anthem. We're seeing kind of like the slow moving crash of Blizzard right now, with a lot of people just really like moving away from them as a studio and as a kind of a company culture. And
Right.
it is very difficult to sustain yourself long term. And this is something that I've spoken about a lot with a lot of my design videos. That when I talk about a topic, I'm not talking to someone who, let's say, just wants to make one video game and then that's it. They're gonna make that one game, then okay, I've got, game dev out on me, I'm gonna go do something else. What I'm
Hmm.
talking about is how can you sustain yourself with your games over 3, 5, 10, 20 years? And the
Right.
scary part is that a lot of people don't think about that. They think, again, like as you were saying earlier, like, I work on this one game for 5 years, I never talk to anyone from the outside world, I release it, and then I buy my private island and retire for the rest of my life.
No, that's a fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Like whenever, like whenever I talk to younger people, and when I say younger, I mean like 18, 19, which is young. It's young compared to me. I'm 26 right now. Like,
Oh, I am older, so now I get to feel even more older.
I mean, I figured I wasn't gonna cry about it, um, but I've been in college for a while, and so whenever I'm asked to like give advice to like someone just entering college, someone just trying to figure out what they want to do, like if they do have a wild, like first of all, I'm of the mind where like you have one life. If you have a goal that just like you want this really badly, like do it. I will not stop you, but be smart about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you want, like for me, I'd like to like make game development into a career, make independent game development into a career. But I still have to be smart about it. I've been to college. I'm financially responsible. I have a job. Um, so when I talk to like someone just entering college and they have a wild dream of like I want to be like a big hit game developer. I want to be a big hit musician. And it's just like I I won't tell you not to do that, but just please be smart about it. And sometimes they may even cite like wild successes like look at Marcus Notch in Minecraft and or look at Eric Barone of Stardew Valley. And I'm like and it's just like and they cite those examples and they claim that I could do something similar to that. And I'm like, that's like saying, don't worry, I could win the lottery.
Yeah.
It's
I
like,
get bit struck by lightning when I walk outside.
yeah, yeah, it's like Marcus Notch and Eric Barone, like they were a tiny bit lucky, but a lot of it came down to like being smart about it, like understanding marketing trends.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because of all their factors, in addition to just a small, all those factors, in addition to a small amount of luck, that they became wildly successful. That's not the norm. And thinking it is a norm is survivor bias.
And I interviewed Rami Ismaili a few years ago from Blambeer, and we spoke about how like so much of the success of his game in his studio came from specifically the time period and just again being flat out lucky. They were
Hmm.
releasing games back then, and he said it very poignantly. If I were to make the same games I made in like 2012, 2011 today, and this was like maybe 2021, his games will have absolutely failed because
Right, right.
that market is not the same anymore. It changed after his games came out, just like the market changes whenever a big name game comes. And as you said, like if someone thinks, oh, Stardew Valley came out, I'll just redo Stardew Valley, or I'll just make a Stardew Valley Lake and I'll get some level of success.
Right.
It's never going to work like that.
Well, I mean, the thing is, why make this is going back to why choose an alternative?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why would someone choose this alternative Stardew Valley when Stardew Valley is still here? Like, one of the reasons Stardew Valley just blew up in success was because Harvest Moon went the way of the dodo.
Yep.
Yeah, like there were fans of Harvest Moon, and Harvest Moon just was just abandoned. And so that audience was craving something like Stardew Valley. And so here comes Eric Barone, and he's like, I'm making a game that's like Harvest Moon, but better, so much more feature rich, and it's on Steam. And that audience was like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted.
Yeah. As a really good example, look at Dwarf Fortress. Dwarf Fortress is a game that before was even on Steam, people were trying to be the next Dwarf Fortress. Like, they were, I've played and I've seen multiple, early access, this is the DF Lite. This is the DF Lite. This is a game that's going to be like Dwarf Fortress, but it's, the super casual version of it. And a lot of those games fail simply by, the weight and, the level of craftsmanship that went to Dwarf Fortress. So that when it released on Steam last year, guess what? It did amazingly well. Because people were saying, wait, so this is the game that I've been playing with better graphics, better UI, and I'm supporting the developer who I love for the last 20 years.
Perfect.
Why, shut up and take my money right there.
Yeah, definitely that. It's like, this is exactly what I love, but somehow it's even better. Mind blown.
And we can rant and rave about this for the next 3 to 4 hours because it
right.
It is such a hard thing. Just tell any dev, just make a Stardew Valley on your own and you'll succeed. Yeah, that's really good advice right there.
I mean, here's the thing. If you're just learning, sure, copy other games. As Steve Jobs is quoted by saying, good artists copy, great artists steal, which he himself borrowed from Pablo Picasso, and Pablo Picasso borrowed that from someone before him. Mm-hmm. So that quote is incredibly ironic. But the wisdom of that quote is to take what's useful, but also try to make it into your own thing. So when you're just starting out learning something, this could be video game development, it could also be any sort of creative field like painting or music or sculpture. When you're just learning, it's fine to copy.
Yep.
It's fine to just copy paste what others have done. When you're, I think the first, one of the first games that I made when I was just learning Game Maker, I think it was a clone of Breakout. Just very simple. I wanted to understand the engine. I didn't intend to sell it, but it gave me experience. It gave me know-how on the engine.
Mm-hmm.
And then after a while, but you can't stay that way forever. Eventually, if you do want to make whatever creative field you're in a commercial creative field, eventually you have to graduate from being a copycat to, okay, I'm going to take what works, but also add some kind of twist. Add my own vision, my own essence into this project.
And that's when we talk about the idea of, I'm building a game, I'm building this, but it has X. And that's where that X comes in. And again, sometimes that X is basically everything. That is your design, that is your marketing pitch, that is what you put literally on your trailer that gets people excited. I played this game earlier this year called Motor Doom. It's basically, what if we took Tony Hawk Pro Skater and we have you shoot monsters while you're doing BMX tricks? And
that sounds awesome.
Okay, it's old. You got me right with that.
And it's you're appealing to the Tony Hawk Pro Skater audience, which again is kind of suffering the same fate of my poor childhood favorite franchise is not getting good treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And you're combining that with the Doom audience, which is now, frankly, spoiled because a game, a relic of a game, has gotten new life breathed into it. So combining the two, it's ideally you have the giant Tony Hawk audience and the giant Doom audience coming together to make one big uni audience. But you also run the risk of the complaint being, I like this, but I don't like this.
Yep.
Even though both those features are core to your game. Like the Doom audience would say, I like the shooting, I don't like the skateboarding or the BMX. And the Tony Hawk crowd would probably say, I like the movement, I like the BMX tricks, it's great. I don't care for the shooting.
Yep. And that's when we get into some more of the trigger aspects of game design of how can you kind of, fit the square peg into the round hole at that point. Because if you tell me this is a Doom Eternal push forward super high level combat, and I'm also going to require you to do, super hand, finger twisty tricks and movement with your other hand, who's going to really be at that level to really appreciate it? There will be an audience. As we said, there are niches for every possible genre. But if that niche is maybe 300 people worldwide, maybe even fewer than that, how do you build a sustainable game or build a marketable game off of that?
Right. Yeah. Definitely a tricky question. I think the strategy it comes down to is whatever crazy idea you have in your head, build that, but don't do what I did and spend 7 years making it.
Nope, and don't take a second mortgage on your house and
no,
quit your day job.
Do not quit your day job.
So with that, as a quick time check, we've been going for just about an hour. Let's talk about our other points. I think this will be a good way to lead into it, discussing some about how to grow a game and its design. So we'll go for, I would say, maybe another 20 to 30 minutes if that works for you.
All right, sounds good.
All right. So with that said, the other kind of design topic that Lee and I were talking about before we started the recording is about adding to your design. Because this is another aspect, I'm sure if for any indie developers, solo developers, even just students watching this, that it becomes very challenging to do. One of the beauties of being like a solo or very small team in terms of development is that you are not beholden to anyone. You don't have anyone standing over your shoulder saying, I demand you put this in your game, or we need to hit the 12 to 18 demographic. But conversely, it means that there's no one kind of reining you in. And we have seen time after time after time again of a game that just goes from being, it's, I'm just going to work for like a year, maybe 18 months, and then it's 10 years later, the game is still not done. We've changed the design like 3 to 4 times during development, and no one has any idea what this game is. And part of this is that challenge, or it's that kind of goal, as we've been saying over the last part of this discussion. It's that goal of creating that X factor of your game. What if I make a first-person shooter that's also a cooking game, that's also a driving sim, that's also a visual novel game? But if you're spending all that time chasing after all these additional systems, all these different mechanics, is it really going to fit with what your core gameplay is? If at the end of the day your game is a driving sim, does it really matter that the player is, I don't know, sewing their own race suits after each match?
Right. In my blog, very convenient that you brought up that point. In my blog, I wrote a post yesterday that talked about design by subtraction, mainly covering the game Titan Souls, which is inspired by Shadow of the Colossus. And before Shadow of the Colossus, there was Ico. And the fascinating thing about Ico is that early versions of the game, it was kind of a Zelda-like. There were multiple areas to explore. There was a fairly complex combat system. There was gear. There were NPCs to talk to. But director Fumito Ueda was like, okay, hold on. Let's ask ourselves, what is this game about? The game is about rescuing a princess. So Okay, those NPCs, are they necessary are they necessary to tell a story of a hero rescuing a princess? No.
Mm-hmm.
That combat system isn't necessary. No, not really. Those other areas, are they important? No, not really. Well, the only area that's important is this one castle. There we go. Let's stick with that. And because of that, Ico is an incredibly, I wouldn't say bare bones, but it's very no frills. Like
Mm-hmm.
the game is about a lone adventurer escorting a princess outside of a massive out of a massive castle. And meanwhile, there are shadowy creatures that try to take her away, and your job is to defend her. That's all. And for some, that's all is pejorative. But for design nerds, that's all is spoken with fascination. It's like, wow, this is so tightly designed. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like Portal, the first one. Like everything that's in the game is deliberately placed there. It Everything that's there feels like it belongs. It feels like a single vision.
Mm-hmm. And another word for that would be it's very straightforward in what it wants to be. If you're playing Ego, you're not there because you're wanting to build a spaceship. You're not there
Right.
because you want Dark Souls level or even just like at the time like Devil May Cry style combat. You're here for a very explicit style of gameplay. And
Mm-hmm.
getting your game to that point, as you said, designed by subtraction as another positive to it, it also makes it very economical in terms of your design. I don't need to build 30 different biomes if my game just
Right.
takes place in a castle. If I'm focusing on, I don't know, swordplay, do I need to invest in having people do art and texturing on different guns or crossbows or whatever? No, we're talking about swordplay. And it makes your design very kind of laser focused because of that.
Yeah. Go back to what I said. It's incredibly important to ask yourself, as the designer, in the earliest stage as possible, what is the game about?
Mm-hmm.
And have that be one sentence. Like, for example, my game Odd Infinitum. What's it about? It's about battling an unknown threat. As in, humanity is invaded by an extraterrestrial armada. You have to battle against it, otherwise, humanity is doomed. So that's what it's about. So here? That's the high level. That's the roof of the game. In fact, actually, here I don't know if you can see it. I wrote it down on a sticky note.
Yep.
So basically, battling an unknown threat. That's the roof. That's what needs to be supported. Beneath that, what supports that overall battling of an unknown threat? Well,
Mm-hmm.
it's two-pronged. There's the actual combat, where you, the space pilot, face off against the boss rush gauntlet of various aliens, each with their own movesets. That's part of it. But the other part of it, after some thinking, I realized this is also necessary. So it's an unknown threat. So of course you're not going to understand everything there is to know about this alien armada. So the other part is discovery. You're learning about the threat as it comes to you. And you're not just
Mm-hmm.
learning, you're adapting. So combat and discovery both reinforce the overall vision of battling an unknown threat. And below combat, what supports that? Well, things like weapons, shooting, moment-to-moment push combat, such as evasion and movement. Also, upgrading your weapons, finding better ones. Those three support the combat. What supports the discovery? I'm considering several features for that one. One possibility is to have some mechanic where you can like kind of snapshot like a particular boss animation, and your character would write a note, like saying something like, there seems to be a strange aura coming from this boss. And you would take that back to the R&D area of the game, and you can use that you could send that to the R&D person, and they'll do some research on it and be like, aha, I got it. I have this ability that can counter it.
Yep. And as you're saying, being able to sit back and figure out, okay, if I'm building a shoot 'em up, okay, what does that entail? Shit moves around the screen. I'm shooting enemies. How do we build on top of that? Like, what is my mission statement for this game? And that is where it gets very difficult. Because as a designer, and as we were saying a few minutes ago, you can do whatever you want. If you want to build an entire like weapon crafting system where you're literally putting all these different parts together to create a brand new weapon, why not do that? But again, that question is this something that is really going to matter to the game? And I would say an even more important question, can you do that and make it work within your title within a reasonable span of time? Because as you're well aware of, and I'm sure as everyone else is well aware of, you don't have money coming in as you're working on these projects.
Right.
People are not paying you just to design a game. They'll pay you for the finished product. They're not, unless you put your game on early access, obviously, but they're not paying you for 5 years of development of a game that may or may not come out. And as a designer, you need to weigh that. Because yes, if you want to build that full-on 100% completely customizable system, that's great, more power to you. But if it eats away at the time you could be spending making your shooting better, or making sure that you have enough money to invest in good art, they may never even get to that point. They may never even see that system that you spent 5 years of your life on. They'll load up your game and go, well, I can't control my ship right, the graphics don't look well, uninstall, and none of what you thought was important the consumer will ever see.
Which is a good thing, or which is a bad thing, but can also be a good thing, because you, the developer, especially if you have perfectionist tendencies, are really bothered by all of the tiny flaws of your game. And it's because you spend so much time developing your game that you notice all those flaws. But does the average player notice? Not really. Unless it's glaringly egregious. But if it's just something as simple as, okay, the UI is just off by one tiny pixel. Even if someone did notice, probably wouldn't complain if everything else is good about it.
Yeah. And again, it's the idea of getting that attractive package to the player. And this is, I think, one of the advantages that indie developers have, is that if someone's buying your indie game, they're not necessarily going to care that you kind of repeated the same sprite for a tree in your background on a scene. That may stick out to you like a glaring, red flag. But is the consumer really going to care? Oh, it's just the same tree in that background as I'm doing all this, Celeste level platforming.
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah, one type of like YouTube's video that I'm fascinated by, it's kind of behind the scenes reviews of like video games, particularly like going into like the back ends of a game. Like the YouTube channel Illusory Wall, his content is about like looking at the kind of obscure hidden mechanics, like kind of out of bounds or background details of the Dark Souls games. Like, for example, Dark Souls is known for its world design. So, and you look off this direction, you see this vista. Okay, what actually is off in that distance? Like, and what does it look like? Like, For example, you're in Firelink Shrine. You can actually look down and see Blighttown. And he's like, okay, let's actually go down there and see what kind of detail, how detailed it is. And Dark Souls is a thing where very far away areas that you may not ever visit are actually 3D rendered. They're low poly and low detail, but they are 3D rendered. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it's one of those aspects that a lot of people who, if you don't really study design or really pay attention, you don't necessarily think about. And here's a fun thing. Here's another way you can drive any developer crazy. You ask them how doors work. In a game I learned from Game Dev Twitter. We look at doors, it's I hit E, door opens, I walk through it. It takes a whole lot more work on the back end side to make walking through a door that commonplace.
Yeah, there are two types of features. Features that are hard to implement, but players think are actually easy. And features that are easy to implement, but players think are actually hard to implement. On this hand, key remapping, that's not hard at all. But stealth, that's actually quite hard to do.
And don't forget, of course, about just add multiplayer to your game. It's very easy to put that in.
Gosh. Going back to the mention of when I was a TA for a game design class, thank goodness none of the student groups were like, we're going to make it multiplayer. I'm like, thank goodness all of you are smart.
Now, another point that I wanted to ask you about, I remember I spoke with Chris Park several times from Arkin Games, and his games have always been very meaty style in terms of their design, their systems. And we actually had this conversation about how do you decide what to fight for in your game? How you decide not to put into your game? And then the third point, how do you decide if something is good, but it's not quite good for 1.0? Maybe there's something that we save for an expansion, or if the game does incredibly well, let's say it does become that runaway breakout success, do we have a kind of this back pool of content that we can add in over, 6 months of DLC, maybe 2 to 3 years of DLC? And it's a very tough line to walk. And this is something I want to ask you about with your game. How do you, or what are your thoughts on what does 1.0 of my game look like? What is my dream vision for what my game is going to be on day one of launch? Versus, let's say it does sell well. What could I add to this game over, we go to version 1.5 or version 2.0? I've seen some games are at version 10.0. They just have almost an infinite development after release. They just keep adding more stuff to it.
Okay, so the question is, how do you know what to include upon release versus what to include somewhere down the line?
Yeah.
The thing is, I let my imagination run wild, and it's the dangerous question of, wouldn't it be cool if we included blank? That's the most expensive question ever. So having some kind of constraint in mind, whether it be time, the effort you're willing to put into it, that's a good way to filter out what's absolutely necessary. It's the same effect as having a deadline. Well, having a deadline is a time constraint. But when you have a deadline for something, you're better at knowing what's absolutely vital and what's not. When you're working on a school assignment and you have an essay to write and it's due tomorrow, at that point you're like, okay, I got to think what's absolutely important for this essay so I get a good grade on it. Same thing with game development. The release date for 1.0 is impending, and you think, okay, so let's think back to our overall what is this about statement, our pillars, and ask ourselves which features support those pillars. I mean, that is the point of what game design pillars are. They're meant to show you what's there to support the game and what's not. If it does support the game and there's enough time to implement it, then, and if you can prototype it quickly and polish it within a reasonable time, then give it a try. But if it's too time-consuming to develop, but it still supports the pillars, perhaps you could put in an expansion. If it is time-consuming or it does not support any of the pillars, best to leave it out.
And as you said, like in terms of prototyping and getting it in the game, that's another very important point. Again, you can spend if you can spend 2 weeks, 1 month to try and experiment something very crazy that could make your game better, that could be worth a solid investment. If it's something that could take you 2 years of learning tutorials to actually get the knowledge to then spend another year to 2 years actually put into your game, that's a different story. And it's another interesting trap I think I see a lot of indie developers and first timers fall into. This idea of making the mega game. That this is my magnum opus. I will put every single system, every single, passing fancy, if I dreamt this idea, I will put this in this game, and it will be this just amorphous blob of mechanics and systems, and it will take 12 years of my life to build. And what oftentimes ends up happening is that this game that feels like 8 games in one, it probably would have been a far better and far more marketable idea if, why don't I just make 8 games? Why don't I just, this is the ship combat game. This is the survival crafter game. This is the platformer game. And I think this is one of the things I want to ask you about as a solo developer, as someone who's like kind of learning their way now. I feel like, at least from my position, watching people who go into games or who consume games today, that we're reaching this point where qualitative experiences are becoming far more popular than quantitative. That the idea of marketing a game today and saying, this is a 600-hour long game, that's not marketable anymore. It could have been 30 years ago when there was only maybe 10 games being released a month. Or, I'm sorry, maybe 10 games being released a year at one point. But today, I think people want that. If I'm building, like going back to the Eco example, if I want this game about escorting a princess out of this amazingly rendered castle, and it's only like 4 hours, but it's 4 amazingly detail-rich hours, that sounds better to me than a 60-hour game where we have to stop and do a stealth section, or we have to then turn into a beat-em-up for an hour.
Right. The thing with the whole, this game has hundreds of hours of content, I think it's because consumers have kind of wised up and have learned what that actually means. Like, what it tends to mean is, like, if a game has 100 hours of content, okay, that means there's 20 hours of good content and 80 hours of padding. That's more often than not what it means. It's just marketing. Yeah, as you said, quantitative metrics, they're great for, bullet point marketing. But as far as, like, particularly the more core focused gaming audience, the ones that are primarily PC and console gamers, they're more likely to look for an experience that's more qualitative. Like, they're looking for a particular feel, a particular fantasy. I mean, that is what games sell themselves on, a fantasy. It's buy this game disc and put it in your console, and you can live out the fantasy of being a pirate or an assassin or a knight. So, yeah, gamers now are looking for, okay, I'm looking for a particular kind of game that gives me the experience of, like, being in a war. Or if you're looking for a multiplayer game, I'm looking for a game that's, like, can be easily set up. Doesn't require everyone to bring their own machines. Doesn't require everyone to know how to use a controller. That's precisely what the Jackbox games are. You just need one person with the actual game. Everyone else can join on their smartphones.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, gamers now are looking for, what can I get out of this game? What kind of experience? What kind of fantasy can I live out when I'm in this game space? As opposed to, okay, I want to zone out of reality for 100 hours. Oh, this game promises 100 hours. Perfect. I think there's fewer and fewer of the latter kind of gamers.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and as you said, the idea, like, if you can actually sit there, whether you are a one-person team or an entire studio, and say, we can build 200 hours of amazing, gameplay-rich content, okay, that's more power to you. You can do that.
Mm-hmm.
How many studios in the grand scheme of things can actually build a game space with 200 hours plus of amazing content every step of the way?
Well, that's one of the reasons why rogue likes and rogue lights took off, because the idea of, okay, we just program in the systems and we tune the RNG in such a way that it generates interesting content no matter how many iterations, then you could, in theory, generate 200 hours of engaging content just by having well-designed systems.
Mm-hmm.
The catch to that is the procedural generation has to be good. The systems have to be good. They have to be enjoyable. Because, like, if your roguelike game doesn't have a satisfying core gameplay loop, who's going to care if it can generate an endless amount of dungeons?
And the other point about that with a roguelike is that a roguelike is not designed to be played for 200 hours. That's not how long a run is. A run could be 30 minutes, could be maybe an hour or two, but then it's a repeatable 40 minutes or an hour or two that you can keep doing again and again. Because at the end of the day, a good roguelike is still kind of short form. It's just a very replayable short form content.
Right. Yeah, it's well said. It's not a consecutive 200-hour experience. It's a cumulative 200-hour experience made of a bunch of 10-minute gameplay sessions.
And that is kind of like the important point for a lot of developers trying to learn this, is that it's what makes a really solid game today, as we've been talking about over this discussion, is that you need to get that moment to moment feel right. You need to make 10 minutes of your gameplay feel, 10 out of 10. It's so amazing. I just want to keep playing. Because then 10 minutes becomes 20. It becomes an hour, 5 hours, days of playing. But if you're, and like to our point, if you're just putting systems on top of each other for no other reason just to include them, you could get, it could take someone 400 hours to play this game. How many people are going to want to invest that amount of time in something that just doesn't feel right? And
right.
This is something that's very salient from someone like me. Again, I played over 900 video games last year between demos, Next Fest, festivals, and all that. Those games run that gambit of, I load it up and within 20 seconds, I want to move on, versus I load it up and it's like, okay, I want to play more of this game. And a lot of designers, again, fall into that trap that, yes, your game could be fantastic, Game of the Year winning after 10 hours of playing it. How many people in the grand scheme of things are going to invest 10 hours before, the game is amazing?
Yeah, like, that argument, or that explanation of it gets good after 10 hours just does not hold water to me.
Mm-hmm.
Just like, okay, why can't it be good at hour 1?
Yeah.
Like, is there a good reason why I have to wait 10 hours?
I could regale you with some stories of some of the games that I played. And it, again, is that challenge as a designer. And it's something I'm sure you've thought of. I'm sure for anyone watching this recording right now, it's going through their minds. How do I get someone to actually sit and play my game for 5 minutes? For 1 minute? How do you get someone to invest even just that fraction of a time? And it's one of the biggest, I think, to go back to one of our original points in this discussion about how much game dev has opened up. It's one of the nightmares of making a game today. There are, again, like right now as we're sitting here, I'm sure at least 30 different games were released on Steam, maybe in the last 2 hours of us talking.
Definitely.
How do you get someone to play your game that's being sandwiched between 10 different visual novels, 18 FPSs, 5 adult games? If I mention their name, the schedule will get flagged by YouTube. And even if your game is legitimately different from anything that I just mentioned, it's still being released almost like a flood into someone's face. How do you get them to specifically focus on your game?
One philosophy I've kind of been rolling with. So if your game is intended to have multiple levels, pretend you're only allowed one level. Make that one level the best it can be. A fellow game developer, I think he called this the rule of one or the rule of only one. And it ties into design by subtraction conveniently. So have one character, one weapon, one level, one boss. Can your game be fun when it's just one of everything? That kind of is what Titan Souls is. You have one bow, also one arrow, you have 1 hit points, the boss has 1 hit points, and also 1 weak points. And that in itself makes for a good gameplay loop. So once your game can work with just only one of everything, then add another, then another, then another.
Mm-hmm.
It's the philosophy of, I think Tim Ruswick said this, if your game does not work with minimal content, it will not work with maximal content. Like, of all the levels in Odd Infinitum, I think I've cumulatively spent the most time on the first level. Like, I've spent like this much on the first level, and like this much on the second, and this much on the third.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still thinking of improvements to the first level. Like, that's how important I view the first level to be.
And that you should. Like, that is a very important point. And again, it's something that I've said a lot here about how much that good onboarding, that presentation when someone first loads up your game, it matters a lot. And I've had discussions about kind of like Nintendo style, that Nintendo, for a lot of their more reflex-driven games, they'll just create like a blank space and just let Mario walk around and jump in. Because if you can make, a completely white room, completely devoid of anything other than Mario running around and doing his jumps, and that is entertaining, you are, on your way there. Because again, if you can make just the simplest actions of your game pop, if you can make just the act of walking this, oh my god, it's so amazing experience, you can add on that. You can put more stuff in. If that feels horrible, and I think this is another trap I see a lot of indie developers fall into. They focus so much on the high level, they forget what it actually feels like to move around this game. And for people watching us record right now, I have played so many indie games where they're trying to tell like a very high concept story or this like incredibly unique gameplay, and then I go control my character and it feels like I'm on roller skates. Or even just like the act of walking, the camera is like very like jerky, maybe it's like low frame rates. It just feels horrible. And if that feels horrible, why should I get invested in anything else in your game? Why should I care that you spent an extra 2 years, making a procedural generated clothing system for your title if I can't even, pick up a sword or shoot a gun without giving me a migraine from just like how horrible that experience is?
Yeah. There's a term gameplay loop, meaning
Mm-hmm.
what happens like iteratively within a game. But within the concept of gameplay loop, there's the primary, secondary, tertiary, and sometimes maybe even more. And roughly, primary is second to second, secondary is minute to minute, tertiary is hour to hour. So the best advice, focus on the primary loop. Focus on making the second to second gameplay as good as possible. Make walking feel good. Make shooting feel good. Make sword slashing feel good. Whatever is going to be done on a second to second basis, make that feel good. Don't worry about anything else. And once that's good, then you can consider the secondary loop, which tends to involve things like progression, like how often does leveling up happen? What happens upon leveling up? Like for Odd Infinitum, the primary loop would be the movement, the shooting, the evasion. The secondary loop would be, okay, leveling up, or I should say, the secondary loop would be the minute-to-minute gameplay of going to a boss level, fighting the boss, going to the shop, and using all the currency you just got to buy new weapons, and repeating that. That roughly takes a minute-to-minute basis.
Yep. And as you focus more on what your primary core or your primary gameplay loop is, that's how you're going to be able to answer questions as to what else fits within it. Because if you can't answer the question of what is my core gameplay loop, how are you going to build an entire game without, again, you having to redo work? And that is kind of like, again, another nightmare scenario that you don't want to waste any time as a game developer. If you spend 2 years of your life building, I don't know, a match 3 game or a match 3 system for your game, and you realize, guess what? This doesn't work at all. This isn't what my gameplay is. Guess what? That's 3 years gone. Now, you can use that knowledge to, let's say, build a match 3 puzzle game in the future. But what you just did does not serve the actual game dev project you're working on.
Right. Yeah, it's important to learn. Always be hungry for knowledge, and it's important to understand what makes a particular genre tick. And if you're not sure what makes it tick, this is where you research. And I say research in quotes because, yes, sitting and playing video games counts as research in this sense.
Yep.
This might be a bit mind-blowing. When I first started out developing Odd Infinitum way back 2016, 2017, the only shoot 'em up game, and there's some debate as to whether this counts or not, was Star Fox 64. I love the hell out of that game, by the way. Oh, I love that game very much. It's my favorite game of the 90s. And so I kind of wanted to make that. I wanted to make Star Fox, but with something I could make, which conveniently was a 2D side-scrolling shooter. But as far as specifically 2D side-scrolling shooters, I don't think I'd played one before. But eventually, I realized, okay, I gotta learn something about this particular genre. Even if it's just watching YouTube videos, like YouTube gameplay videos, just observe, do something to understand what a game is like on a moment-to-moment basis. Even better if you could actually play a particular game and understand, like, how it feels moment to moment. Like, how am I feeling? Like,
Mhm.
am I having fun? Why am I having fun? Ask yourself all these sorts of questions as you're playing. That's how you think like a designer.
Yep. And again, it's how you start understanding, why did this game do this? Why is this
Hmm.
game like that? And again, it's like these are some of those questions that to some people it sounds incredibly easy to answer, and to other people it is impossibly difficult because it is one of those things
Right.
you've mentioned a few times, like being in designer mode when you're playing a game. Like I'm in game design, like analyst mode with just about anything that I play these days. And it's one of those things that once you start doing it, it becomes almost second nature. But just because you've played video games for 30 years of your life, 50 years of your life, doesn't mean that you've been actually studying those systems. Being able to actually
Right.
understand, okay, they put in a double jump here because of this. Or,
Hmm.
they wanted to focus on sword swinging, and that's how these mechanics evolved into that.
Uh huh. Yeah. When I notice small things like that a lot, particularly in like From Software's games.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to give an Elden Ring reference, because I've been playing that for quite a bit. Um, so in Limgrave, there's the Bridge of Sacrifice, which goes down to the Weeping Peninsula on a cliff. Like, I think it's like right before the Bridge of Sacrifice. There's a small patch of tarnished gold and sunflowers, which are conveniently one of the two ingredients needed for holy water pots. And
Mm-hmm.
why are those there? Because there's a death bird that appears at night in the Weeping Peninsula, and death birds are weak to holy damage. So that patch of sunflowers there is From Software hinting at you, like trying to communicate to you, saying, "Here's this. It may come in handy."
Mm-hmm. And again, there are some people who probably look at it and go, "Oh, why did they stupidly put the sunflower patcher? Why will I ever use that there?" And
Hmm.
then completely miss that point when the death bird comes down and says hello.
Yeah, it's just like, oh, I mean, some may not even question it. They just may say, "Oh, sunflowers, cool."
Yeah. And if we talk about communicating stuff to the player, we'll be here for another 10 hours. That is
Oh yeah,
a massive topic. Um,
yeah, definitely.
But I think we are just over an hour and a half. I think we can start to wrap things up. I know it feels like we
All right.
just got started. But I do have a few other kind of more specific game dev questions for you. And then
Hmm.
if there's anything else you want to talk about with Odd Infinitum, we can bring that in.
Okay.
So, one thing that I want to ask you about as kind of like working on your first game dev project and being a solo developer. For right now, for people watching us recorded, Odd Infinitum is on itch.io.
Yep.
As someone starting out, how has it been using itch.io as you've been, learning game dev and doing all this at the same time?
Are you asking how is it working
Yeah, like kind of like
with
as a
itch.io?
platformer, like how, like as a platform for putting your game on, like has it helped
Oh,
you?
okay.
Have you been, using it effectively? Anything like that?
The thing is, if there's like the best place to put your game is Steam.
Mm-hmm.
Like, little to no argument there. Like, it has the like one of the biggest, if not the biggest, um, PC gaming audience. So if you're making a game for PC and you want to reach potentially the biggest audience possible, of course, put your game on Steam and have the Steam page up as early as possible. But while you're in the process of building your Steam page, it's a good idea to put it somewhere. Put it somewhere in a public space where anyone could find it. And that in itself takes bravery,
Mm-hmm.
because when you're a solo game developer, when you're a solo artist, you get attached to your work. It's your baby. And so the thought of putting your baby just out in a public space is terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
But it's super important that you just do it. Even if it's like, get your work as good as possible and just put it somewhere public. And putting it somewhere public is It's what itch.io is good for. It's a public platform, and it's free to upload a game to itch.io. It's free to create a page. It's free to upload patches and updates. So it costs you practically nothing to put your game on itch.io, and it's a public space to showcase your game. But don't expect a lot of eyeballs on it. Don't expect like a lot of traffic going towards your game.
Mm-hmm.
When we're just starting out, that's fine. Like a low click-through rates is likely what's going to happen, but it's out there.
Yeah, and as you said, like it's just sometimes getting eyes on your game for the first time that can be such a huge deal for a first-time developer. This idea that, hey, you know, this thing that I've been making the last 3-4 years of my life, someone else who isn't me is actually looking at it.
Yeah. And it's particularly terrifying because the general gaming audience, let's just say they expect quality and they don't mince words. They do not mince words. If your game is bad, they will give the thumbs down, don't recommend, and they'll write an essay about how this is a garbage game, it sucks, it should have never been made. And that hurts.
With regards to the design of Odd Infinitum, is there anything else that we haven't touched on? Is there anything specifically that you want to touch on about the game's design?
About the game's design, let's see. Talked about the primary gameplay loop and the secondary gameplay loop, talked about pillars, talked about its overall vision, what's it about. That covers it in broad. I could say it's chock full of Star Fox references. Yeah, the first boss, fun fact, is like visual design wise, it's heavily inspired by one of the penultimate bosses of Star Fox 64. Like if you played Star Fox 64, you'll know which one. Oh gosh. One thing about shoot 'em ups, about the shoot 'em up audience, if there is a story to a shoot 'em up, largely they don't care. Like shoot 'em up games are heavily rooted in arcade design, which had to forego story to make room for like the moment-to-moment gameplay. But even if there is a story, even if there is background lore, the average, like it's either just very sparsely told, or the audience just doesn't care. And it's not like Dark Souls lore where it's actually like intriguingly crafted, but just very hidden, and you're asked to like figure it out and piece it together. This is just the case of there's a story. Oh, cool.
Yep.
I guess I'm here for the gameplay.
Yep.
What makes Odd Infinitum different? It has a story focus. There's actually a plot going on that is like it's not like in your face. There's no exposition dump, but it is front loaded. It's not just in the background for you to figure out. And there's a cast of NPCs, each with their own personality, motivation, and also most of them have a quest to complete that you can go along with. So that makes it somewhat unique in terms of the shoot 'em up genre. In some cases, it could be a drawback, but in a different case, it could be a selling point. A shoot 'em up with a front-loaded story. This is new.
But the challenge, of course, as we've said, is understanding what the market is expecting. Because
Right.
you could build, because I've seen games that will kind of front load their story, but it's also a 2D platformer. Like, if I'm loading up your 2D platformer, I want a platform. I don't want to have to spend 40 minutes watching a cutscene before we actually start your game. And but as you said, like if someone could create a very cinematic, very story-driven platformer, that can elevate that game further.
Mm-hmm.
But you still need to make sure, as we've said over the course of the discussion, you still make sure that your core gameplay loop is the star of your game. Because if
Right.
there is nothing that's going to drive someone to play your game, they're not going to see that. And again,
Mm-hmm.
I've said this many times that I have played games where it's a fantastic, amazing game, but you have to jump through all these other hoops before you get to it. Unless you're someone who's, either being paid or is covering it for content, how many other people are really going to do that when they have, this backlog over here of 500 games, all within like 20 seconds of loading up? They can just get right into it. And I think to bring this back to the point about like Vampire Survivor likes, one of the reasons why Vampire Survivor blew up is that it is such an incredible pick up and play game. You
Mm-hmm.
load it up, and within 5 seconds, things are dying on screen, lights are flaring, and then I see some developers are like, well, what if we make Vampire Survivor, but it's very slow? What if it takes like 5 minutes before, you can actually start melting things on the screen? And I'm just sitting there going, it's different, but
But why?
yeah, like it's different, but why would you it kind of goes to that issue of, trying to reinvent the wheel. If the
Yeah,
wheel is
yeah.
perfect, why should we try and make it a triangle wheel? It's different. It's, like it's a talking point, but is it a good talking point? Is it something that's
Yeah.
going to get someone to play this game more? And a lot of the times the answer is no.
Yeah. I mean, be different, but also be practical. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Being different for the sake of being different tends to just lead to something inferior. But being different in a way that either improves upon the formula, or if not improves, just gives some kind of twist on the formula.
Mm-hmm.
Those are those are better options. If your different idea like satisfies either of those, then it may be a good time. It's probably a good kind of different.
Mm-hmm. And again, it takes that understanding of what makes the genre work. If
Mm-hmm.
you want to make a first person shooter where everyone is, I don't know, playing dodgeball, yes, that could work
Mm.
as a design. But you also understand, why would someone play a first person shooter to begin with? If you approach this, and I've seen again, like I can regale you with examples and stories until it's tomorrow. But if you start from the opposite, saying, I want to build a dodgeball game, but I also want to make it about first person shooting, and you're trying to make these two things work without understanding them, you can end up with a game that is a
Mm.
really solid dodgeball, but it's absolutely horrendous to play in first person. And you, again, have to be able to understand what makes these genres work. In the beginning, we were talking about like the difference between a roguelike and a roguelite. Or even, as you were saying, trying to explain to someone what is a Souls-like in today's market. When you use these terms, you are creating an expectation from that player. If I
Mm-hmm.
say I want to build a 2D platformer like Mario, everyone's automatically going to know what that is. But if
Right.
I don't hit that goal, if I say this is like Mario, but all the jumping is horrible, all the movement is horrible, the camera doesn't focus right, everyone's going to look at me and say, what the hell is wrong with you? This is not like Mario. Now, maybe that could work if I said, this is a, experimental art game where all the platforming physics are wrong.
Yeah.
But again, it's like, yes, it's kind of saying, yes, I made this game to be purposely bad. Why don't you play it versus playing a Celeste or another award-winning
Yeah.
platformer?
The thing about like artistic experimental stuff, like I'm all about like pushing boundaries and like
Mm-hmm.
like making what's the word and like subverting
Mm-hmm.
like norms and expectations. But if it's bad, you can't convince me otherwise. It's like what makes art, any kind of artistic field, impressive is that there's skill behind it. Like, sure, with music, like anyone, like I listen to a lot of metal, so I'll use it as an example. Like anyone can just like scream and make loud noises.
Yep.
It takes talent to scream well, to scream powerfully, and to scream healthily. That's the trick. That takes practice, like years and years of practice. Yeah, anyone can just pick up a mic and just yell into it. But don't try to convince me that this is good metal music.
And as a interesting point, it's also something I need to learn when it comes to doing these long casts and discussions, so my voice doesn't die on me halfway through.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep, but I think that is a really great point. Again, anyone, and like to bring this like full circle, as we said, like if anyone takes a course on how to code a platformer in Unity or how to code a shoot 'em up in Unreal or whatever, that will give you that knowledge. You can follow that set of guidance, that set of code 100% to the letter. You can make a 2D platformer. You can make a shooter. Does that necessarily mean that you understand what makes a good platformer or a bad shooter? Probably not. And we saw this period, like maybe like 5-6 years ago, kind of like when Steam Direct first popped up. When, again, you could just spend $100 and get a store page. That people just put whatever the heck they wanted. And yes, you can have that store page. You can use the every single free asset on Unreal or on Unity and put something together. That doesn't mean people are going to give you $2. It doesn't mean they're even going to give you a nickel for that game.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be able to, again, understand what goes into this decision making. Why is someone going to play a shooter? Why is someone going to want to experience a shoot 'em up? And then, as we've said, take that and expand on it. Take that core gameplay loop and start to say to yourself, well, is a shoot 'em up, but I have X. And that X is what you want to sell to people. Because if you don't, guess what? Your game is just going to fall into that sea of all those other games. And as my final point, before we get into like hour 15, you brought up the first-person shooter, the boomer shooter craze.
Right.
There have been, in the last 3 years, a tremendous amount of boomer shooters, shooter likes, Quake likes, Hexen likes, all the other shooter likes you can imagine. But a lot of those games are nowhere getting close to the like of Dusk. They are not reaching Doom Eternal levels. And again, that problem is they are trying to copy that same formula to that letter. But they're not giving me or giving the audience something new. What is that juice? What is that reason to play your game versus playing Dusk? Or versus playing Doom? Or versus playing Quake? Because at the end of the day, if you can't answer that question, the consumer is not going to answer that for you. You, again, as a developer, I'm sure you wish that, someone who plays the game says, you know what? This game is, and they write your entire marketing pitch for you.
Yeah, like that's what's great about the software development industry.
Mm-hmm.
Like particularly if you do agile development, you have the client there, and they specifically say, "I need an app that does this, 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 and this," and you go, "Okay, I'll make that." And 2 weeks later, you're like, "Here's the app," and the client is like, "Okay, this is good, this is good, this is good. This needs improvement, this needs improvement, this needs improvement." With game developments, the gamer isn't not going to sit there and design the game for you. If the game is good, they'll be like, it's fine. If the game is bad, they'll write an essay about it.
Yes. Or they'll do a video essay on it. They'll spend like a 2-hour video about how horrible your game is. down to the actual like font you use for your title screen.
Yeah.
And here's the other like strange point. Then you have like the idea that I built this game around all this, and everyone latched onto that one thing that maybe I just threw in because, I ran out of ideas one day. Maybe it's a grapple hook. Maybe it's, flipping pancakes. And everyone talks about that, and they completely disregard all this other work. And you sit there going, well, maybe I should make a pancake simulator as my game.
Maybe a market for that.
Yeah, you never know. But I think with talking about pancakes, I think that's a good point to sort of wrap things up on. So before I let you go for tonight, Lee, just a few kind of like general questions about Odd Infinitum in terms of like releases and stuff like that, and then we'll say goodnight.
Okay.
So, I guess my first question is, so right now you have your itch page. For people watching us record, I will include a link to it down below. In terms of what's on there, like what will someone get if they check out your demo?
So, it's a very light demo.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the rule of only one, there is only one level. And because it's a boss rush, that one level is just the boss battle. But there's also the tutorial appended on before it. There's one level. There's about 8 weapons to play around with. And there's 3 characters to interact with. It's a very light experience. And where I'm at right now, it's in development. Currently, there are 4 levels in the game right now. Only the first one is polished to a mere shine. That's what's in the demo. So my plan right now is to polish the other 3 levels up to a mere shine and release that as just a 4-level standalone. And then from there, I hope to find some kind of funding to make the entire game. So that's my plan for now. But for now, you and the entire gaming audience can enjoy the Odd Infinitum demo.
All right, and I guess this is the question I always hate to ask any developers, but I know someone's going to wonder: do you have any time frame for when, like, the full demo, or when you have like all 4 levels, like, ready for someone to check out?
I am aiming for the end of July.
Okay.
Because I'm on summer break right now. It's a good goal to reach.
All right. And do you see yourself putting this on Steam in the future, or will you keep it? Okay. I always have to ask that when it comes to these.
Yeah. The hang up right now, it just needs to be content complete enough to actually have good screenshots. And once all the store assets are there, I'll mark it as ready for review and just have it up.
Right. And I guess this is, again, another one of those questions that it can cause a lot of stress to developers. So I have to ask this. Have you given any thought to what you will do